Hi everybody, and welcome to this session of the Crafty Online Distilling Conference, Colouring Spirits, a Frank Discussion. And we've got Tom Simpson here from Union Distillers. So thank you for joining us, Tom.
All good. I'm glad to be here.
It's a controversial topic, and lots of people don't really want to talk about it, but then it strikes me that that makes it even more important to actually record a session on it. So thank you for popping your head above the parapet, as it were, to have this conversation. Great. So, I mean, and you make a whole range of different spirits, don't you? So we're not necessarily going to be very specific about what products we're talking about. It's a very general kind of thing that we're talking about today. But do you want to just tell us a little bit about what you do and how you kind of got into it and that sort of thing? That would be helpful, I think.
Yep. So obviously with Union Distillers, where we do white label. So we do the likes of supermarkets and lots of other brands and things like that, where we produce for them as well. While also having our own brands such as Two Birds. So we do a huge range of different spirits and different flavors, which obviously comes into that with colors and everything else. So we get sort of different questions on how to color and what to color with all the time. So it's something that we deal with quite often. And then sort of my backstory is I went to uni at Newcastle, did chemical engineering. And while there, I sort of developed a love for distilling while there, and then decided from that to take it on as a job, and worked for Union for the last 2 years, and I'm now head distiller. So, been fun.
Good opportunity to to be quite creative as well, I guess, with different people coming in and doing projects and things like that. There's consistency is one thing, but there's also working with new clients, which I think is something that at least most distillers I speak to, that's kind of the thing they enjoy most, is the experimentation. Yeah. So I mean, moving on to color in spirits, and this has been something that is not new by any stretch of the imagination. You go back to the sort of fruit gins that Gordon's were doing in the 1930s and things like that, and they, as a commercial product, they had colors to them. And of course, if sloe gin was being made back, hundreds of years ago, by its very nature, it's a liqueur technically, but it's a product that's got a color. So I thought it would be good to sort of set the scene and talk about the different ways that a product can be colored, and potentially if you might use more than one method as well.
Yeah, so there's two main methods to it. So you've got either the infusion of botanical or fruit or vegetable sometimes to give the color to itself. So it's a very natural process, which is obviously sort of the very classical process of adding the color to it. Or you've got the other way is obviously using a coloring, which can be either natural again, or it could be an artificial coloring that's been made. And obviously they have different stems inside of them. So when you're doing the infusion, you could be looking more at using a concentrate, which has benefits and negatives to it maybe. And obviously when you're doing that infusion, you're adding flavor to it at the same time most of the time, as well as adding color, which has its benefits as well if you're aiming for a certain flavor into the gin. So either side has different benefits to them, and there is reason to do it, I think, within the industry, especially with customer bases.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably one of the first bits of booze I ever created, or at least like added value to, if you want to put it in that fancy marketing term, was probably strawberry vodka. That was probably the first thing. And got a kiln and jar, got some strawberries, chopped them in half, put them in there, poured the vodka on, and then of course the vodka goes pink and the strawberries go white, and then you've got some. I mean, it still tastes like strawberries, but it's very, they're white in color, and obviously that's just, I think, it's a very neat way of kind of explaining that compounding, that infusion kind of method. But you're quite right. You've got that flavor that's coming from that, and I guess, I mean, the thing is, just taking that one example, this strawberry vodka example that I talk about. I mean, one of the lovely things about that was when you were drinking it, whether you're drinking it, in a little shot, or whether you were sticking tonic with it or lemonade or whatever it was that people wanted, your drink had this blush pink color to it. And I think like that is something that there is a demand for. And I guess like that's a big part of the reason as to the why of colouring spirit. And I mean, I don't know if you're the same, but I've been to bars, I've been to you know, pubs, and there's been a particular, might be a blue cocktail, might be a pink cocktail, might be an orange cocktail, and people are kind of like, well, what's that? What's that pink one? I'll have that pink one, or something like that. I must say, I've done that myself, mostly with blue cocktails, but I have done that a couple of times. Like, what's that blue one with the candy floss as the garnish? One of those.
Yeah, no, definitely, like within custom as well, it definitely adds a thing to it, because it insinuates normally what the flavor is as well. If you've got a pink color there, obviously you're looking for a sort of strawberry color flavor, or raspberry or something like that, which obviously in the summer really appeals to most people, because as you know, it's going to be refreshing. So it's a massive sort of stimulus to what people look at and what people buy, obviously, is the color of it, because it just adds that added benefit of knowing, without necessarily seeing the label, you've got an idea of what you're actually looking at in the spirit, which I think behind the bar is a massive advantage when it comes down to it. And you think about cocktails, they're always colored to a certain extent, and that helps and adds to the sort of whole point of the cocktail and everything else, doesn't it? So it's definitely, yeah, definitely something that's great to have inside of it.
I remember recently I was at a spirits competition. We were tasting a citrusy gin, which we had scored very highly. It was absolutely excellent. And one of our colleagues, very well-known person in the gin industry, and they remarked, like, my only thing I would improve in this is possibly make it a very light sort of yellow color. Now, yellow is difficult, right? We're into the difficulties of having a yellow colored gin, but they were like, if it had that vibrance to it, it would just be that final indicator.
Yeah,
the visual would hit, you know, the nose was there, the taste was there. It's going to be fantastic in tonic or soda water or something, but if that color was there as well, that would be, and it's not saying they have to do that with everything. I mean, like the Hayman's exotic citrus, grape citrusy gin doesn't have any, because it's a London dry, you know, it doesn't have any color to it, and that's fine. But it was interesting, like that this is what this person was saying, and I thought, oh, okay, I could see that for that. But what product it was, I don't know. It was a blind tasting, but there we go.
Yeah, interestingly, with some colors actually do get a sort of stimulus on what people's perception of flavor is. You can actually try it without the color in and with the color in, and they'll think it tastes more of the flavor just because it's the color, which is just a sort of mental thing that you go through. And it seems to be a thing that it just increases the amount of flavor you perceive to be in the bottle by how much color's there.
Well, imagine, I mean, I've seen you know, the rum guy Pete Holland do it with like a bottle of white rum, and then, or unaged rum, I should say, let's be precise, and then he'll add the colouring to it, and imagine, like, you know, you just think, oh, now I'll taste it. If you didn't know, you might be, just the look of it, you might be more down to thinking, oh, I'm getting more of the spicy that you might associate with wood, even though it's never even been near a barrel.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Of course, question on the rights and wrongs of that, to some extent. Yes, it's a, you know, some people would say it's a manipulation, some people, you could just say it's a maneuver or something like that, but it's all part of the experience, and I don't know that that's necessarily, I think as long as you're clear about what's been done, I guess that's sometimes the problem with rum, but like, if you're clear about what's been done, I don't see why the experience is the experience, right?
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I think within it, if you're explaining what you've done and how you've done it and why you've done it, it's not an issue. It actually adds to the experience of the customer and what they're tasting. So from the perspective of drinking it, if it gives you added benefit on what you're tasting, then I can't see it being a negative side of it. As long as you're doing it safely and everything else, which you mostly would be, so it'd be fine.
Yeah. So we've talked about those two main ways of colouring spirits. What are kind of the sort of pros and the cons? And I guess sometimes they could be both. But so let's talk about the compounding. So you talked about how you might you're probably, if you're compounding, let's say, use my strawberry example, because I think that's not a product that we're actually making, so it's one that we can talk about. This you know, it's added flavor though, that's the thing. So I wanted to color this spirit, but I've also added flavor to it. So in that instance, it's a good thing, but depending on what you want to do, that might be good. It might unbalance the flavors or something like that. But I mean, what are the other pros and cons of using that infusion kind of method?
So obviously, again, with the pros, you've got the fact that it adds the flavor in there as well. So there's there's that pro, and then you've got further on from that, you've got, it's the natural ingredient you're adding in, so it's a very natural process that you're doing, which obviously has its benefits in terms of what you can, is on the label of the gin and everything else.
And the perception.
Yeah, it's the perception of what it is to clients and things. But you've also got sort of within the fruit that you're adding, it doesn't always impart that flavor as well. You can get some fruits or vegetables or even botanicals that will impart that color, but it doesn't necessarily give an overall flavor to it, but it adds a really nice color to it. The cons of that, I think, is always sometimes the intensity isn't always there depending on what you're using, and actually discoloration in it is more common in a infusion, because they're more perceptive normally to UV light and oxidization. So you potentially, if it's a darker color, you'll sort of sometimes get a sort of brownish tinge coming to it after a few months, if not quicker sometimes, depending on what you're doing. And then if it's a lighter color, quite often it will go clear over time. So especially with pinks and reds, you get a really big oxidization sort of happening on that, where it'll either turn a clear color or it will go slightly brownish red, very much depending on how dark you're doing it. But again, that can be helped through the use of, if you're doing it with a natural process, you can use a concentrate or something, which does seem to hold the color better, which might be due to the fact it's got some antioxidant in it when it's been done, or it's the fact that actually the fruit, once it's macerated and made into a concentrate, it's got a high level of antioxidants in there that stop oxidation, which can help a lot obviously with it. And especially with darker colors, it's really effective with sort of like the likes of blackberries or things like that, where you get a really dark color in there and it keeps that dark color. But with the lighter colors, yeah, again, it's just trying to work out and make sure it's not losing the color too quickly for you, because if someone expects it to be that color and it's not the color, then you've actually getting a negative effect on it. So it's making sure you're getting it the right way around, so you're not creating a negative effect on what they perceive the color should be, and they're not getting that, but it still tastes the same, but you're losing that color. So that's a big one.
I've certainly seen that on, I think it must have been another time with this, but like the strawberry vodka would do that, it would move to a very, very, very pale sort of pinky yellow, and then pretty much nothing. And I've certainly seen products where they've been flavored with just an infusion of rose petals, and it's the same thing after a period. I mean, they knew that was going to happen, that's what they wanted, but they knew after a period of time, yes, you could put it in some protective glass, but then it defeats the point of having the color in the first place, because you can't see it through the glass. When you talk about concentrate, are you talking about juice? Is that essentially what you're doing?
Yeah, so sort of either concentrated juice, or it depends what you're using, but you can't quite obviously get sort of a concentrated juice or a concentrated coloring for it, but it basically adds, the majority of it is to do with the flavor, and then you get the additional color in there.
Because I know a few different producers in different varying ways, some more concentrated than others. That's part of that, rather than doing the maceration of the actual fruit, which I guess there's also the time of prepping that, and then you've got to dispose of the fruit and things like that. They might buy in some concentrated, might be strawberry juice, might be cherry juice, might be something like that, and they kind of do it in that blending way. So it's not the same as adding like a very small, tiny sort of essence. It's this kind of sits in the middle, but again, the stability seems to be better. But I mean, I think that's the first thing, is you've got to be aware that stability can be a problem with the color and with the flavor as well. Do you find, or is it more of a color thing than a flavor and aroma thing?
More of a color thing, but you do get a small amount of stability in the color, the flavor as well, that it does over time, it will degrade as well with the oxidation. You do get a slight different taste coming through, where it's a natural product and you're changing the compounds. That's why it's changing the color. It's also just changing that taste very slightly. And in some products, it's probably more noticeable than others. So you likes of sort of a rhubarb gin, you might taste that sort of oxidation coming through more than you would do a sort of strawberry gin. You wouldn't necessarily have noticed that taste change.
And then moving to the so we kind of covered that kind of middle ground with the concentrate, and then moving to essentially the adding of essences or things like that. And in some cases, some of the stuff that people use is their own form of distillate that they've made. I know we've got another talk in the conference on hydrodistillation, which is essentially making botanical essences, and so you could do the whole process yourself and add things in that way. But I mean, what are kind of the key considerations and the pros and cons for that? Because like sometimes I hear people sort of just say, oh, it's just got flavoring added to it, as if like just adding flavoring to something is the easiest thing in the world. Like it's just like making up some Ribena or something, which, to be fair, depending on the person, is also not very easy.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting one, because it's if you're adding a concentrated color or flavor, so it is a natural color or natural flavor that's been sort of concentrated down to a very small amount, or it's artificial flavor or artificial color you're adding. It's how much you're adding, and to make sure that you're balancing the recipe still completely out. So it's a whole sort of range that you can do, and it's how concentrated that flavor is to then how much you're adding, and making sure you're not overpowering everything else in there, sort of thing. And obviously within that, you've got the colors that the artificial colors are very good at holding their colors, to be honest with you. And most of them would be the best ones to use in terms of actually keeping that color there and a consistency all the way through the thing. Because obviously, as well as infusion, you don't always get that consistency throughout from batch to batch. You can't guarantee that the color will be exactly the same throughout, because you might have a different season of growing. It's just slightly different color. You just get a slightly different hue coming out of the infusion. Whereas a artificial coloring, it's on a color palette. It is guaranteed to be that color every time, essentially. So if you're adding in the same amount every time, you should get the same color out.
Yeah.
So it has that added benefit of a complete all the way through the batches, it'll be the same color. So it just adds that consistency throughout. But even within artificial and natural colors, you can still get degradation over time from the color. So even the likes of reds and pinks are really hard to keep hold of.
Yeah.
So even when you're using an artificial sort of a Southampton 6 red or anything like that, over time you will still slowly lose that color on it. And even as you said, even if you cover the bottle up with a UV cover or anything like that, it's still, we've actually trialed it with UV coatings and things, and you still do see slow degradation of the color anyway. So as much as that UV color, the UV coating slows it down, it does still occur, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Only so much you can do. Obviously, as bottles develop and the coatings develop, it's probably becoming better and better. But it's still
still an issue for sure. And the colors, I mean, there's various people, I speak to people quite a lot about these sorts of things, and I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, people are quite cagey, so I've heard many stories that I can't specifically repeat. But what I can say, I think would be fair, because I've heard it from so many different people, is pinks are particularly difficult to hold fast, and greens as well. You know, and that ranges even from into absinthe producers and things like that. Actually, you know, it's things like, it's one thing just having it here in the UK, say, or having it for maybe a period of the year. But if you're having it sold year round, if you're wanting to export it and ship it off to wherever it might be, where it might be sitting in customs on a hot airport tarmac for a while or something like that, these are all things that are going to put your product under more stress in that color kind of point of view than otherwise. Not just the color, but everything else as well. So
yeah, no, it all contributes to the flavor and the color and everything else within how you're keeping the bottle. So again, you've got to think about where you're tending it, what you're doing with it, where it is. And even sort of the pH of the liquid can sometimes cause differences in how well the color stays. So there's some colors that will be a lot better in, so an acidic product might hold the color better for, I think there's a couple of pinks and reds out there that are better in acidic sort of liquids. And then similar way that I think there's a couple of blues that are better in alkaline liquids. So it's matching that to what color you're doing at the time.
Yeah.
And it's just finding out that information on what potentially is going to help your product keep that color the most. So there's information out there that you can try and find on it, and obviously depending on where you're getting the color from, or if you're infusing it, or if you're buying a coloring in, then you might be able to find that information very easily, or it might be a little bit harder to find, but it is definitely out there to try and find it. And obviously you can trial and error and sort of play around with it and see what you can come to.
So that leads me to our next question. So let's say that I had, let's just for argument's sake, I had 1,000 litres of a product that I wanted to make, that I wanted to have a colour to it. Now, if I probably don't really want to trial and error with my 1,000 litres of, let's just say that I'd made some strawberry vodka, like keep with the strawberry vodka, but I'd done it through some element of distillation, but I wanted some colour because I wanted that visual cue. If I have a little beaker of my strawberry vodka and I put my pipettes of colour into it, and I work out, right, that's the amount that I want, is it a linear scale up to the IBC? Because for distillation, it wouldn't be. You're doing it on a small still up to a big still, doesn't work like that. But for something like this, is it relatively linear? Is that going to give me enough guidance? Can I do it on a small scale and then scale it up?
It is relatively linear. It's something always to watch. So with certain colors, you do get a slightly difference in how it works, but normally it's linear in the way you do it. So you can scale up from a litre measure to 1,000 litres. But what you want to obviously do is have your litre sample that you've made in a very close proximity to where you're making it, and then you can basically check it. And so you'll what I'd suggest you do is you only add sort of 80% of what you're expecting to add, and check that color's around there, and then you would step it up to the point where you're at the same level. So you've got that ability to come under and work upwards, because if you go straight to the point and it's over the top, then you've got a slight problem of either you've got to water it down with more product, or you've got to work out what you're doing to try and get it back to the color you wanted it.
It's a bit like a haircut, right? You know, you take more off, but I can't put it back on. And any sort of cons to using these sort of concentrated flavors, like whether they're natural or the artificial colors? I say flavors, I meant colors. Cons for using those?
It's definitely so. Within certain markets that you're going into, obviously you've got to look at what the customer would like in there. So if it's an artificial coloring, sometimes supermarkets might not want that in their shelving because they don't accept numbers or whatever else comes along with it. And then again, same with natural colorings, that sometimes it's how quickly it'll fade compared to an artificial coloring. And so it varies on where you're trying to sell to and what you're trying to do with it. And again, what sort of story you've got going alongside this bit. If you're a very natural company and everything else like that, it's probably going to stick towards a natural coloring rather than going towards an artificial coloring. So it all depends on what your own company values are and things like that, to what you would want to do with it, I think.
So mostly the main con is a perception aspect. Is that really what you're, I guess, and you're relying on, well, with anything, but you're relying on another company. So if a company decides they're not going to make that color anymore, or because you're like the only one that's using it or something like that. But I mean, that's to be fair, that's true of almost anything, isn't it? Like, you know, you're relying on a company for something else. All right, well, that's good. And what about the idea of using both? Because again, I've spoken to some people and they're kind of like, well, we do some natural infusion. Again, let's use my strawberry example. So we do the natural infusion, we're getting the flavor from the strawberries, getting the color from the strawberries, but actually we do add a little color in addition, so that that degradation is more limited.
Yeah, I've seen it before that you can use both at the same time. So you'd use an infusion which gives you that color, that gives you the flavor, but also you step it up slightly with a natural coloring or a artificial coloring, which just gives you that slightly bit more stabilization throughout, and therefore stops the degradation of color more, and so it will last longer on the shelf or under UV light. So it's definitely done, and it's not a bad thing to look at and try and do.
It's a policy control thing more than anything else.
Absolutely. It's also gives you that consistency throughout. So if your infusions aren't always giving you the same color, using that extra bit on top will just give you that sort of consistency throughout. You wouldn't need to use much on top to bring that consistency back to it. It's just recoloring very slightly to bring that level back to where you are.
But that, I mean, that seems like a reasonable compromise to me. It seems. Is there any con to this compromise other than the combination of the cons of the two?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's an overall con of that compromise really. I think it adds a lot of benefit to it in terms of being on the shelf. It looks the same throughout, so it's not you're going from one box that they've opened up, put on the shelf, and then they've opened up another box, put that on the shelf next to it, and it's slightly different colors, and then you've got someone looking going, oh, that's different, why is that different, type of thing, because it's next to each other.
I mean, that's the thing. If people, both retailers and consumers, if they were happier to have inconsistency, which I understand why they're not, and they're not, but if they were happier to have inconsistency, then you wouldn't need to do it. So what, like well, I want a totally natural product, but I want real consistency, and you're like, you can't. I remember speaking to someone who they had a color changing gin, you know, which we're not talking about colors, but you know, they were using the pea flower, and you know, it's a universal indicator, right? So and they were saying, well, the problem is the color fades. Well, yeah, because it's a flower that's infused.
Yeah, it's happen.
What can you do? You don't want to put a wrap around the bottle because you can't see the color changing. And it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, perhaps what you were saying a little bit about maybe being a bit more alkaline, maybe that's the only real thing, but that's only gonna improve it. Well, it will improve it, but you know,
it'll improve it. But again, that's the whole point of that color change, is that you're going from a slightly alkaline to acidic.
Yeah.
So it's making sure you're still doing that. If you're making it slightly more alkaline, if you're adding a tonic to it and it doesn't turn it acidic enough to change the color, then you've destroyed the point, sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
You take into consideration, obviously, within that. But yeah, that's a different one. Obviously, with the color changing, is the fact that actually, do you get a more stable product from the color you're starting with than what you're ending with? So if it's a blue color to start with and it's changing to the red pink color, is that beneficial to you? Because actually, it'll hold that blue color for longer than if you try to just color it a pink color in the first place.
You kind of really want some inbuilt instability in the color changing.
Exactly.
So let's come to the safety aspects of things when using color. I'll just let you if you've got some thoughts on that.
So obviously within safety, you've got to make sure that you're under legal limits, if there is any legal limits within it, especially if you could use preservative alongside a color, maybe just add a little bit more stability to it. So there's ones out there that are sort of antioxidants in how they work and stop the oxidization, which are normally more to do with natural infusions, and then you're adding that preservative on top. But with those, obviously, they do normally have a legal limit, so it's checking you're under that legal limit to make sure it's a safe product for consumers. And then other than that, you want to make sure, obviously, what you're using to color the liquid is a safe color to use, so it's not poison, or it's not got some type of toxin in it that you're using. So obviously, certain fruit or veg, when you're imparting color, you are imparting a flavor or the chemicals as well. So you could impart a toxin from it. If you're using a flower that's poisonous, it's going to impart some poisonous parts of it. So you probably don't do that. But yeah, great color probably. But yeah, so you've got to obviously consider all of that side of it. And then again, with an artificial color or things like that, you want to obviously make sure it's a food safe color before you're using it. Because you don't want to turn around halfway through having colored your liquid and then be like, that's not safe to use. Don't do that, because you've wasted a lot of liquid, sort of thing. So it's just getting the information and making sure you're all safe within what you're doing before you put it out to market, to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a bad position or endangering people from drinking it, essentially. Great.
Okay. Well, I think that's absolutely fantastic. I think it's a nice, neat session on this topic, and I think we've. I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you again. I think it's been very useful, so I'm sure this will be widely shared and widely watched. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon.
Cheers. Thank you.
Well, hello. Now, unfortunately, we haven't got a live Q&A because Tom's a very busy man. He's given us a huge amount of his time anyway. But I had one question, so I'm going to ask it now, and this is kind of like the bonus Easter egg. And that was the question was, Tom, have you had anything to do with either sort of shimmer or glitter or gold leaf and things like that in gin? Because I know that, you know, at different times, particularly sort of Christmas time, that seems to be something that some people might consider looking at.
Yeah, so we have dealt with it and looked into it in the past. sort of with the addition of the glitters and everything, it's obviously that you'll get the food safe glitters that you're adding to the bottle. Normally they'd sink to the bottom of the bottle and sort of you remix them in, so it adds the color back in and it swirls around, obviously. And they do have the benefit of normally that because they're solid particle, they don't lose their color as easily as the liquid. So there are the benefits there of that, but it does keep the color normally quite well. And quite often the liquid is also colored on the side of that as well, so it's sort of the double whammy of both the glitter color plus the color of the liquid, which adds a sort of benefit to it and everything. And again, with the gold flakes, you've got the gold flakes in there, which sort of add that sort of tint to it. Within doing it, you've got to sometimes consider slightly the safety of it in terms of how you're putting it in the bottle, because obviously you don't want to put a filter or a fine filter onto your bottling system, because you want the glitter and the gold flakes to go into the bottle. But obviously you've then got the problem that if you're not having a filter on the bottle, can you guarantee that you've got no other particulars going into the bottle? So you've got to very carefully think about how you're blending up everything, which is just slightly different perspective to put on it, just to make sure you're doing it in a safe manner. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider if that was something you were looking at trying to do. And
I'm right in thinking there's limitations of how much metal you can put in a.
Yeah, so again, there's sort of yeah, you don't want to put loads in, obviously. But yeah, no, there's limits to how much you can put in, and normally if you're buying it from a source that have done it, or sort of they'll supply with you with what those limits are, and probably normally advise you on how much you're putting in to give you the right amount in the liquid, because obviously again you don't want people chewing on your gin, or
yeah,
probably not the most pleasant experience otherwise.
I remember having a gin once, which I think was limited to only 10 bottles or something like that, and it was blue and gold for the colors. So it's a blue gin with gold leaf in it.
Yeah,
and it had so much gold leaf in it. I had one gin and tonic, and there was so much gold leaf in it. I think probably just someone had some, because it was so small, they just had the edible gold leaf.
Yeah, going all out.
It was yeah, quite, I mean, from a cost point of view, there's one thing, but I was like, this is a lot. This is a lot of gold to be consuming.
Right, just layering gold inside you.
And it does. It doesn't go through your system particularly quickly. I certainly read some articles about some US student who was really liked Goldschlager, and it kind of just builds up, and they just had particularly high levels of gold in them because it didn't flush through. Even after they kicked the Goldschlager habit, for those that don't know, it's a cinnamon flavored thing with gold leaf in it. Even 6 months afterwards, they still had this really elevated level. So it can be fun, but I think it's just gonna be, don't put too much in. Well, that's a lovely Easter egg, Tom, thank you very much.
All good. Cheers.